The hidden pain and struggles of Ottoman concubines. Behind the golden walls of the Ottoman palace, countless women lived lives hidden from history, lives marked by longing, fear, and silent tears. For many concubines, beauty became a curse, and love turned into an unreachable dream. Their smiles masked a deep, hidden pain. One the world was never meant to see. During the Ottoman Empire, the lives of concubines were full of contradictions. While some managed to rise to the highest ranks of power, the vast majority suffered various forms of humiliation and hardship. Concubines were considered personal property of the sultans and princes, with no rights or protection. Here, we will explore this dark side of their lives, with real examples from Ottoman history. From the moment a concubine was purchased in slave markets, her life was reduced to a commodity to be bought and sold. Concubines were brought from various parts of the world, including Europe, Asia, and Africa, and sold in markets such as the famous Istanbul slave market. One of the most famous concubines sold in the slave market was Hurrem Sultan, who was a Ukrainian concubine before being sold to the Ottoman palace, where she later became the wife of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Many concubines suffered physical and psychological abuse within the imperial harem. The abuse included whipping, beating, and public humiliation in front of the other women or servants. Concubines were treated harshly, and in some cases, sultanas or higher-ranking officials ordered their torture. For example, some concubines were beaten with sticks or whipped as punishment for even the smallest mistakes. Sexual exploitation was an integral part of a concubine's life in the Ottoman palace. Sultans, princes, and guards considered concubines as their property and had the right to sexually exploit them. An example of this is Sultan Murad III, who was known for having sexual relations with many concubines and fathering a large number of children with them. A concubine's life was not protected by any laws, and she could be executed for the slightest reasons. For example, the concubine Sennaber Sultan, a concubine of Sultan Ibrahim the Mad, was executed merely because the Sultan doubted her loyalty. Executions were carried out using brutal methods, such as strangulation with a silk cord or drowning in the sea. When a concubine reached a stage where she was no longer desired, whether due to aging or losing her attractiveness, she was sent to the Palace of Tears or the Old Palace. This was a place where concubines lived in complete isolation, far from public view. An example of this is Sultan Handan, the mother of Sultan Ahmed I, who spent her final years in isolation after losing her influence. Some concubines could not endure the cruelty they faced and resorted to suicide as a means of escaping their suffering. Although rarely documented, cases of concubine suicides did exist. It is said that one concubine during the reign of Sultan Murad IV took her own life after being severely humiliated by the valid Sultan, Queen Mother. Only a few concubines reached a natural death, but even that fate was filled with misery. Elderly concubines were neglected and left uncared for, left to die in complete isolation. For example, the concubines who had served Sultan Bayezid II ended their lives this way, spending their final years in an old, distant palace far from the main imperial palace. When a concubine was no longer needed, she would often be sold again in the slave markets or transferred to other families. This transfer usually meant a harsher life, as the concubine could find herself in even worse conditions than before. An example of this is the concubine Mahidevran, who was sold after the death of her husband, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and moved to another palace where she lived in difficult conditions until her death. Sometimes, Punishments were imposed on groups of concubines at the same time as a form of collective discipline. For example, during the reign of Sultan Ibrahim the Mad, the Sultan issued an order to execute a number of concubines all at once due to his suspicions that they were conspiring against him. The punishment was carried out collectively, with the concubines executed simultaneously without any trial. Concubines were also vulnerable to betrayal and false accusations from their fellow concubines or the palace guards. Slander was widely used as a tool to get rid of rivals or those seen as a threat. For example, the concubine Hayda Sultan fell victim to a false accusation. She was accused of treason and executed based on this slander. In some cases, concubines were sent to remote villages or rural areas to work as servants under harsh conditions. This form of exile was considered a less severe punishment than execution, but it still meant the end of the concubine's life as she knew it. These women lived in difficult circumstances and were treated like ordinary servants with no rights whatsoever. In the end, many of the concubines were completely forgotten after their deaths. There was no attempt to document their lives or mention them in history. Their existence was reduced to continuous suffering that ended with a silent death. Even those concubines who played important roles in the palace, like Kosum Sultan, met a tragic end. Her life ended in murder, and she was buried without ceremonies befitting her former status.